We have freelance journalist Alexander Zaitchik, author of Owning the Sun, A People's History of Monopoly Medicine from Aspirin to COVID-19 Vaccines. Alexander, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate having you here. I'm here with Emma Vigeland.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's start at the real beginning. I mean, like this dynamic of patents and of particularly in the context of medicine. But let's talk about where this we have patents called for in the Constitution of the United States, obviously. But let's talk about the sort of prior to that, where we start to first see this type of like notion of intellectual property, I guess loosely said, and then we can move into patents as why we have them in this country.
The interesting thing about patents is they sort of begin life as a negative, not as a positive, because in Elizabethan England, there was a general ban on monopoly that was a way to constrain crown power. And the patent system was a carve out within that general ban on monopolies. Inventors' rights were the exception to this general ban, and they were made an exception on the belief that they would spur economic growth by attracting foreign inventors to England. That they would spur the creativity and imagination of the English people and lead to new inventions, new trades, new techniques. But they were always controversial, this exception of inventors' rights. And there were those, including many of the people that we associate with the rise of free market capitalism, John Locke, Adam Smith, who were very skeptical that this exception was justified. And they believed that, in fact, it would constrain knowledge, the free flow of knowledge, and would inhibit the growth of new industries by incentivizing the blocking of information flow. And that is basically where we get inventors' rights, was this very controversial carve out to a general ban on monopoly, which was a way to put a limit on royal power, which was very corruptly handing out monopolies on all sorts of trades, including in the colonies, which inherited this exception from the British.
Do we have any, I don't even know how you would begin this, but has there ever been an attempt in terms of like on a databasis to assess this? Like, I mean, I look at like the developments when we have like more open technology, right? Like when we have the internet gives us a good example of like sort of software that is open software. And we see people, build things for it and build off it and whatnot. But do we have any like sense of that sort of fundamental sort of belief that providing a patent of any length of time necessarily spurs invention, broadly amongst a society?
There are studies of different industries and sectors, and it's still a heated debate. That's an important point, that this is not a settled matter where there's some sort of, proof along the lines of physics that this is a functioning innovation spur. Absolutely not. And there is considerable evidence that the opposite is true, beginning with the entire history of scientific advance before we had patent systems, where somehow innovation happened without the dangling fruit of becoming a billionaire during a pandemic. So there's that, but there's also just recent history where you can see blocks and walls put up around very important fields of research that inhibited, slowed down, and weakened lines of inquiry. I mean, just think about the two mRNA vaccines. What if there had been an intellectual property pool that had forced Moderna and Pfizer and their government patrons to put their research into a common area that everyone could examine? Maybe we wouldn't have had two mRNA vaccines that required these incredibly low temperatures to transport and store. We might have been able to have advances there. So yes, it's a valid question. and one that is very much a subject of debate still.
And I would also guess that, I mean, outside of the innovation in and of itself, there's also a gatekeeping quality to it as well, right? In terms of how one can develop connections to secure patents, the money that's involved. Can you talk a little bit about how that keeps some people out of the process?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly political institution, the patent system. By definition, it is the government intervening in the economy to protect rights of what is now mostly corporations. It used to be, sole inventors, these backwoods kind of the myth of the backwoods lone genius, which has not been true for a long time. So now it's basically the government intervening to protect the rights of large corporations, which is extremely political. And grotesquely so, because those corporations have now gamed the patent system to the point where the government is no longer even really the one calling the shots, but the industries, especially in pharmaceuticals, are obliterating the constitutional mandate of the patent system and the rules that had been applied to it for a long time. Now you've got these monopolies that go on for 50 years. They're basically de facto endless monopolies when they were supposed to end after a certain number of years.
I want to get back to that obliteration in a moment, but also, while we're still on sort of like broadly speaking, the general topic of assessing the value of patents to society at large. There's also a tremendous amount of things that have been developed. I know this from having talked to some medical VCs, essentially. There's also a tremendous amount of things that have been developed, particularly in the context of medicine, that would be incredibly helpful to people, but the whatever company could not find a way to necessarily make it profitable. So they sit on these patents as a way of making sure that nobody else finds a way to make it profitable. And we have all sorts of things that could be very helpful to the American public or to the world, frankly, that are just shelved because someone hasn't figured out how to make it profitable and they're sitting on it. Almost like in the same way that Hollywood will buy up a film script and just make sure that nobody else, produces it, because the worst thing in the world for you is I bought this script and now Disney's turning it into a multi-million-dollar hit. It makes me look like I don't know what I'm doing. But even in that business, there's a turnaround time at least. But so do we have any data on that? Because this is the part that we can't see, right? We don't know. There's nobody out there to aggregate all the things that we don't have because they're behind this sort of curtain.
Yeah, this gets at another betrayal, the original betrayal of the constitutional mandate for the patent system in the first place, which was to spur, and I'm quoting Article 1, Section 8, progress in science and the useful arts. The idea that a patent could be purchased like any property right or protected like any other piece of property for the purpose of obstruction, and to protect market share and block the development of that idea or knowledge, to block progress in science and the useful arts, is directly counter to the language in the Constitution. And it unfortunately has been happening since the rise of the corporate research lab in the Gilded Age. That's really when we started to see this behavior. And the courts stamped their approval on it. They basically rejected the constitutional language and said, no, it's just a piece of property like anything else. And there are some very famous instances of the government intervening to wrest those patents out of the hands of defensive corporations, using them defensively in the public interest. And one of the most famous examples of that is in 1954, the Eisenhower administration took a crowbar to the Bell Labs patent vault and basically disseminated all of the technologies that resulted in what we now call Silicon Valley. Transistors, early solid state transistors, lasers, or all that early technology in the 50s was diffused as called for in the Constitution, not because the patent system was functioning, but because it had become this sclerotic corporate defensive fortress tool, and the government had to step in and smash it. And there are other instances of that. It should happen a lot more often, but yeah, it's a problem, and it's been one for a long time.
What I mean, just go back into to when that became, when that decision to allow patents, which were sort of like a unique intervention by the government, to become almost, banally other types of property, right? Like, when did that first develop? And then we'll jump up to the late 70s, early 80s, when this thing sort of like gets really sort of hypercharged, I guess.
You start to see the seeds of that legal revolution in the Jacksonian years. He thought that he was democratizing the patent system by turning the patent into just a piece of physical property that could be done with whatever you wanted if you were the owner. And it started to really gain steam and undermine the constitutional basis of the patent system in the 1880s, 1890s, with the rise of these huge corporate research labs. Westinghouse, Alexander Graham Bell is probably the best known of them, in which they, embraced this old idea of the Franklinian genius. But in fact, their corporate practice with regard to patents was undermining the soil that gives rise to the lone individual genius, because they can't research anything because these patent thickets are amassed by these corporate research labs and these corporations. So they were in fact choking off the possibility of future Franklins, while embracing this idea that had become completely anachronistic. And in the New Deal, that's when you have the government finally say, wait a second, this is a folklore that you guys are talking about. The patent system does not in any way resemble this myth from the early 19th century. It has in fact been degraded and corrupted, and the government has to step in and intervene, or else this is just going to get worse and worse, which is in fact what's happened.
Okay, so first off, we should say that there's never been a piece of technology or an invention in medicine or any bit of progress in any form whatsoever in the, I don't know, invention world, as it were, that has not been based upon work that has been done prior. Right? Like, I mean, this should go without saying, but there's nobody who started from baseline zero and just created something new. It all is based upon work that has existed before. So when you start to throttle the availability of that work in narrow areas or broad areas, you're inhibiting these things. So what was there anything material that happened during the New Deal era to change the patent system, or was there just a sort of renewed vigor of antitrust that sort of like after the fact implicated the patent system?
No, the New Dealers, beginning in the so-called late New Deal of 1936, were extremely conscious of the corruption of the patent system in this country, and they made it a focus of their studies and their work. In the Department of Justice became extremely involved in patent enforcement, and they raised the bar for corporations to claim monopolies on invention. And part of the reason they did that was exactly what you just said. It was sort of an epistemological insight of the late New Dealers that knowledge does not spring from a single individual mind in any instance. It is a cumulative trans-historical process. And the idea of trying to put a stake in any one invention doesn't really make sense. And this goes all the way back to the ancients, which is why there was so much resistance to the concept of inventors' rights for so long. Knowledge was understood to be the shared charge of all humanity and all of the people that contribute to that constantly growing store of knowledge. And then you had a sort of Christianization of this idea, where trying to claim knowledge became a sin of synonymy, as a trafficking in spiritual things of spiritual value, because they were gifts from God and everybody had them and everybody contributed to them. And the Enlightenment sort of resecularized this idea. And it's a very deep tradition, because it's such a basic, obvious insight into how things happen. And they don't just spring from the floorboards of a company's in-house inventors. They are carried over from the centuries. Isaac Newton famously said, "If I see farther, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants." This is not a new idea, but it's one that unfortunately has been forgotten. And any sort of patent reforms of the sorts that are needed will begin with this insight, as the New Dealers started with this cornerstone.
Did they provide any structural reform to the system that had lasting implications, or was basically it just became a sort of like a culture within the Department of Justice and Antitrust that once we get up into the sort of Borkian era of antitrust, that culture essentially of enforcement goes away? And so was there any structural reforms that were done at that time?
What they did was they maintained an extremely high public interest standard for corporations to claim monopolies on research and invention. And that high standard was measured against the very recent experience of these corporations allying with Nazi industry in basically cartel arrangements based on patents. So it wasn't just an economic issue in the US, it was also a national security issue. And the New Dealers were extremely serious about honoring the constitutional charge to diffuse knowledge through the patent system rather than allow it to be used as a block and as a way to maximize market share, not just in the US, but globally with official enemies.
Okay, so let's the next big sort of change in that regime, although I guess it gets a little bit diluted as we get further away from the New Deal, happens in during the Borkian, I guess, Reagan era, right? Will you walk us through, I guess, both Stevenson Whittler or Bayh-Dole? These are the ones in the Senate, ones in the House. The measures that are taken to sort of like, I don't know how you would characterize it, but to sort of, I don't know, create a even more sort of exploitive patent regime, and also, which I did not know, the creation of the basically the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which I had no idea emanated out of this. Will you talk about those changes?
Sure. So World War II was when federal research really came into its own. Federal scientific research was a trickle compared to what we saw during World War II, with everything from the Manhattan Project to the industrial penicillin project. And it was understood during the war that that research commitment was going to carry over into peacetime. The days of minimal federal funding of science were over. And then the question emerged, who is going to have access to the fruits of all this research? And the history of the United States up until that time had been mixed. There was a dangerous precedent in World War I where the corporations walked away with all the patents and then ended up becoming large corporations allied with the Nazis for the next World War. And the New Dealers were determined to avoid that happening again. And they wanted to institute a policy, a default government patent policy, where research that was funded by the US Treasury would retain into the hands of the government and the people. It would be under public control. Now, the contractors who were working with the government in this federal research establishment that was clearly coming into view wanted to have control. So basically between 1945 and Bayh-Dole and then Stevenson Whittler, which you mentioned, you have a tug of war between this New Deal vision of publicly funded science under public control and industry as a default matter taking control of patents resulting from government research. And that was 25 years of extremely hard fought, 10-yard fight political warfare. One big event in there was John F. Kennedy intervening with regard to medical science and saying, no, corporations must meet an extremely high public interest standard to be granted a monopoly on that research, especially medicine. And it was very hard for them to meet that standard. because in most cases, how can you argue against diffusion? Why wouldn't you want more companies able to research this stuff? Why wouldn't you want more companies able to produce it to lower prices and create a competitive market? There's really no good reason in the vast majority of cases to prefer private monopoly over public control, which results in open access to this knowledge. And that was overturned in Bayh-Dole. So basically between Kennedy and Reagan, you have this tussle. And then once that switch flipped during Reagan, and then it accelerated under Clinton, which, we all know what that administration was. Even now, it's still moving, if only by inertia, very much in industry's favor. And there may be some conversation within the current administration about how to stop that, but it's not clear that they'll get anything done.
Talk about the development of the Court of Appeals. I mean, I was just like, I've talked about that court. This is where much of what the administrative state, the federal government does, gets hashed out, as it were. And it really is, I mean, sadly, that process is pretty problematic in many respects, because this is where, this is the existence of that court sort of increases, I guess, the likelihood in certain situations that industry lawyers come in and they chop apart, Dodd-Frank, let's say, and SEC regulations and FDA and EPA. But was it the patent that was the big impetus behind this?
Yes, along with flipping the New Deal Kennedy policy in favor of default government ownership, pharmaceutical and chemical industry was extremely focused on taking away the power of liberal federal court judges to hear infringement cases and to determine where that public interest standard was with regard to patent monopolies, especially when it came to medical science. And they finally got it under Reagan. And what did Reagan do? He replaced those often liberal-leaning judges with industry patent lawyers and lobbyists.
Just to be clear, they were afraid of it showing up in, let's say, the second district
exactly,
Court of Appeals,
especially the second district,
which is like the New York region, essentially. And so this is court packing, right? Like it's just by another name.
It's court inventing and then court packing. It's even worse.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't like the results that are coming out of the courts that exist. So I'm going to create a new court. And then, of course, I'm going to put my people in there, and it's going to create a new culture that comes out of that court. I mean, for a long time, you will see the fifth district, I think, Court of Appeals is circuit Court of Appeals is like Texas in that area. And it's much more conservative. So these courts create their own sort of like culture that is reflective a little bit of their region, or is, I guess, reflective of their region. And in this instance, we've had that dynamic in this circuit Court of Appeals. It gets worse when you have a majority of Republicans than Democrats, but still this underlying sort of like problem with antitrust and whatnot is highly present there. And I had no idea that court, the impetus was to protect.
It's a federal court. They're all appointed, and it has effectively flipped the ratio of monopolies being knocked down. It used to be 20% survived appeal, and now it's something like 80 or even more. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's very high.
Has it gotten better than it was at that time, that court?
It's still doing what it was meant to do effectively.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
the industry's in no hurry to get rid of it.
All right. So let's move into sort of what we're seeing more in a more specifically, with COVID. I mean, you and I have talked about this in the context of Bill Gates. We've talked about it in the context of Moderna, but that was on the other Peacock show. So I'm not afraid to go back over some of this, because the role of Gates in this, because that to me seems like, but for Bill Gates, the pressure would have been far greater on Moderna and Pfizer. Both directly, and I think just sort of like in terms of what the perspective is on all this. Will you talk about, you know, Gates's role in this, and, you know, his fealty to monopolies over these things, has sort of trumped making sure that we don't have a problem with COVID, or an attempt, a really legitimate attempt to get everyone vaccinated.
Yeah, well, you were right when you said that it would have been a lot harder for these companies to make the case that they should retain complete control of IP during a pandemic, because they're not very adept at making moral arguments that don't really exist. And we saw this during the HIV/AIDS crisis, when they eventually had to climb down from their lawsuit against Nelson Mandela. And what do you know? This is right around the time Bill Gates pops up on the public health scene, as he's being sued for antitrust on 2 continents. And he has this enormously expensive reputation laundering operation kick in. And when he lands on the global public health debate, he lands on the side of the companies who were being excoriated around the world for suing the Mandela, trying to produce or import generic antiretrovirals. Since that time, in the intervening 20 years, he has built up this very well-known philanthropic organization focused on global public health issues. And whatever absolute good some of those programs have accomplished, they play a very important function in a larger debate around the system that creates these enormous inequities in the first place. And he has shown zero interest in questioning the assumptions underlying this system, including during the pandemic. Crucially, during the pandemic, when there was a discussion taking place about making vaccines a global public good, of suspending rules as usual, business as usual, when governments were using this language, and there was a medicines access movement pushing hard to create space for alternatives, who shows up again? Bill Gates, the good guy, with a solution that he claims can solve this problem. And he says, look, we don't have to suspend business as usual. We can have equity. We can solve all these problems. Suddenly, you have medicine access groups on one side, the industry on the other, and then a triangulation taking place. And the more you look at Bill Gates's role in his groups, the harder it becomes to avoid the conclusion that he's essentially running an extremely effective interference operation for the pharmaceutical industry, because these conversations take on a very different dynamic when he's in the picture.
But that's how he, that's how he became a very wealthy man, is by propping up intellectual property rights, and both in his, the computer field, and now he's taken that to the global stage in terms of global health. Like, that is what is so fascinating to me. And there are some cracks in his public persona as this big philanthropist, but can you talk a bit more about how he specifically has like laundered i- i- his role in keeping drugs away from people, and protecting intellectual property, and making it seem like he's actually some sort of benevolent billionaire who's providing those drugs for the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it's who he is in a very fundamental way. But the weird thing about Gates is it goes back even before he made his money. When he was just a geeky teenager, sort of getting his toes in the early Silicon Valley scene, he was writing these screeds against the open source ethos of the early Silicon Valley, which was partly a result of that Bell Labs antitrust suit that we talked about earlier, because the Silicon Valley understood that that's kind of where they come from. And also there's the psychedelic influence, who knows? But Gates was like this lone figure early on, arguing very loudly and obnoxiously for knowledge monopolies, even as a teenager. It's kind of bizarre. So yes, this is who he is. And in the context of the 2 great pandemics of the last quarter century, he has come down with all of his resources and influence to try to keep the global IP regime, as enshrined in the World Trade Organization's TRIPS regime, very much firmly on its rails. And he has devoted all of his influence in the media, his financial influence, his influence in international institutions, including the World Health Organization, to make sure that argument does not proceed and that IP is enshrined under all circumstances, including global public health crises.
Has the failure to get the world vaccinated, and the failure of was it COVAX, right? Is the thing that came out of the UN?
Yeah.
Has that failure been sort of like digested and people have reacted to it, or is it just sort of like it feels like it's just sort of like filtered into the ether and nobody's really talking about it because he had specific sort of like proclamations as to how this was going to go, and it didn't go that way.
No, it didn't at all. You're starting to see some reckoning there. The Washington Post had a piece, I think, a week ago that pretty much went down the list and explained the timeline and the major conceptual failures of COVAX. Interestingly, Gates was barely mentioned, even though it was pretty much staffed by his people and run by his people and was very much his brainchild.
I understand that the entire project was really just a way in which to sort of intercede in the idea that there's going to be shared knowledge for all of these vaccinations.
Yeah, at the time that he introduced COVAX and the accelerator of which it was a part, because it also dealt with therapeutics, the larger framework, there was a mechanism being developed within the WHO called the COVID Technology Access Pool, which was going to be a globally shared resource in which all governments and corporations would temporarily, for the duration of the pandemic, place their IP. So there could be, research without walls. The idea it would accelerate development and also accelerate scale up, because once you have vaccines and therapeutics, you have to make a lot of them if you have a pandemic affecting billions of people. And he showed up, he landed and he said, no, none of that's necessary. And he used his influence, his many armed influence, to basically steer governments away from it. And basically say that the companies are right. We can tap into the better instincts and charity and benevolence of big pharma, and their patron states can solve this problem without any outside the box thinking.
I mean, that's a kind of a macro copy of what we see here in the United States, where philanthropy is a way to avoid taxation and larger cuts into the coffers of rich people and corporations, and then on the international level, waiving IP would stop the gravy train, even though these pharmaceutical companies made a ton of money as is, but it would stop eventually if you were to waive IP. And so then there's like conversations about, let's make it about donations, because then it's all on your terms.
Yeah, it's much more friendly terrain for corporations whose main and only concern is maintaining IP. And it's worth remembering that at the beginning of the pandemic, when the first billions were offered in Operation Warp Speed, a group of Democratic congressmen tried to revive this older liberal tradition of publicly funded science in the public interest under some minimal public constraints. And what was Pharma's response? Stephen Ubel, the guy who runs the main lobbying group, said, if you try to attach even the slightest social obligations to this tranche of $8 billion, we will take our ball and we will go home. We will not participate.
Okay. I understand that threat. And I also just need to just like editorialize for a second. The reason why you don't want to allow for the existence of billionaires is because I think Bill Gates is not doing this to make money as much as like the guy's, a loon about this stuff, and it's his ideology. And it just so happens that because he's a billionaire, he gets to impose his ideology on the entire world when it comes to vaccinations. That's just like, you should not be allowed to have that much power in a country or the world, period. End of story. But this part about, we'll take the ball and go home. Two-part question. One is, was it within the ability of the US government to say, fine, because there's other people who have other balls. And if we develop this with our money, they're going to sign up for it. A and B. Do we have a sense of like just how much money was expended on the development of these vaccines? We can take the mRNA, we can also take the Johnson and Johnson, and how much money was expended on the development of these vaccines in pure dollar amounts versus the amount that the US government either gave them as, money directly in terms of the development for those vaccines, or in the promise of whatever you come up with, we're going to give you $1 billion worth of orders, which is like, if I'm going to start my podcast and someone comes up to me and goes like, look, we're not going to put any money into you, hiring people and putting the computers, but we're going to promise to buy $1 million worth of advertising from you, regardless of what you come up with. I'd be like, all right, I'll put that money into these computers because I know I get $1 million coming. And that's sort of the deal that we had with Pfizer, right?
Something like that. Regarding the ease with which we could have walked away, it would have been a lot easier if there hadn't been disinvestment or a complete rejection of the creation of some sort of public sector with pharmaceuticals. And part of the story of the last 40 years around the world was a privatization, disinvestment in public sector pharmaceuticals in Europe, which is now why you're seeing more and more conversations about we need to get that capacity back so we're not dependent on corporations, foreign or domestic. We have to be able to do this on our own. Without that, because we have been so enthralled to the privatization, private contractor model, we did need probably significant corporate partnerships. Now, within that, there is a lot of historical precedent for the government maintaining a role as a senior partner, going all the way back to the penicillin project during World War II. There are legal rights the government has to perform that role, even outside of an emergency context, as during the pandemic. I'm sure you've talked about a lot of these on the show, not just in Bayh-Dole, but the Defense Authorization Act. There are a lot of levers in the government toolbox that could have been used that just were not. I mean, basically, the industry got what it always gets and what it has come to expect as its birthright, which is everything on its terms with zero demands in the public interest or the government making any sort of even feigning self-respect in terms of enforcing the rights that any industry would themselves claim under a similar arrangement. These companies would never in a million years forfeit the rights that the government does on a routine basis with these contracts.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. Alexander Zaitchik, author of Owning the Sun, A People's History of Monopoly Medicine from Aspirin to COVID-19 Vaccines. This is...
I love the title.
It's a really important book, I think, for people to understand this dynamic, and because it tells the story of both this dynamic of socializing the costs and privatizing the profits. It tells the story of the implications of that, particularly in terms of medicine, where we have, God knows how many people have died and will die because of the privatization of these vaccines. And it also tells the story of like how sort of incrementally, it's almost like the frog in the boiling water. First, you limit the capacity of governments to produce these things. Then you give them these companies the leverage, and then it's it's off to the races. I really appreciate your coming on, and we will put a link to Owning the Sun at majority.fm and in our podcast descriptions and whatnot. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.